Hi, welcome to this summary of the webinar on effective partnership working, building partnerships that thrive. So this is part of the small international development program that the FSI is running, funded by UK Aid. The session includes starting out with partnerships, practical tips for effective partnerships, developing and sustaining effective and inclusive partnerships, and risk management and safeguarding. So starting out with partnerships, it's important to firstly look at what you're bringing to the table. So is your organization in good working order? Are you ready to embark on a partnership? What are you going to bring to your potential partners? Make sure that you're not in a position of needing to be saved. You're not looking for someone to ride in on the white horse to perhaps solve some of the challenges that your organization is facing. So basically make sure that your organization is resting on solid foundations before going out to seek partnerships. Then looking at your possible partners. Do you have any existing partners? Who may your potential new partners be? Do you have similarities and differences? Do you have any upcoming opportunities where there's potential for partnership? How do you differ? Are you looking for an implementation partner or a different kind of partner, such as a fundraising or administrative partner? And the rest of this webinar focuses on the implementation partner model. Are you going to have a criteria for new partners? We took a moment here to talk about what makes a good partner. And these are some of the things that came up there. We've got a good communicator, trustworthy, having shared vision and goals, highly motivated and passionate, being a good problem solver, team player, self-confident, being able to delegate, and being able to execute the work strongly. And then there's program expertise in the program area that your organization is working in. So look at your potential pool of partners. Think about whether there are any quick win partnerships that might produce great outcomes for your beneficiaries. And then consider whether there are any partnerships that might work but might take quite a long time to establish. Do you understand all the benefits and challenges? And are there any deal breakers when it comes to looking at potential partners? Start the discussion with a formal exploratory meeting. Aim for in-country teams comprised of local people, and perhaps start to consider things in your initial meeting, such as understanding each other's organizations and the input that you would bring to the partnership, why you want to collaborate, the possible benefits and risks, and the kind of models that you might consider. So some practical tips. Are you looking for an informal partnership? Do you want it to happen organically and naturally without any limitations in the form of memorandums of understanding or terms of reference? Or probably more likely, you may want a formal partnership where you do have an MOU, terms of reference, and so on. Is the UK organisation going to have a hands-on or hands-off approach? Will there be a lead organisation in the partnership, or will you mutually work to manage the work that the organisations are going to be working on together? Where will the decision-making take place? Is it a funder-recipient relationship, or is it a closer partnership where you work together to agree on strategic direction and program decisions? Your MOU will set out the overall rationale and mission of the partnership and the organizations, the shared values and principles, the governance structure, goals and objectives. And your terms of reference is more of a practical document setting out sort of operational approaches, whether there are any external stakeholders, something as straightforward as a meeting schedule of when you'll be meeting, how often, even setting into the terms of reference the dates of those meetings, and then some detail about admin and other kinds of support that your partners may need to access. You'll need to consider how to manage financial resources. Who will do the fundraising? Where should the money be held? Where will you hold your reserves? Will your partner organisation be holding reserves that are there to support programme costs, for example? How often will you be transferring money from the UK to a partner? Ideally, when trust is built and you feel confident in the capabilities of your partner, then perhaps less frequent transfers would allow more autonomy from your partner organisation in terms of spending and reporting. Having strong financial reporting policies and procedures for your partners should help to build that trust. You might want to consider something like a quarterly transfer, and in advance of that, having your partners send a financial report for the previous quarter and a financial forecast for spend for the forthcoming quarter. You might want to consider how you'll manage budget overrun. So, for example, will you allow your partners a 10% contingency where they can make decisions around spending slightly outside of the agreed budget when inevitably things change or urgent decisions need to be made about budget spend? When it comes to actually meeting with your partners, some practical meeting tools: take the temperature, ask how everyone's getting on, try to ask some informal personal questions at the beginning of meetings to get a sense of how everyone's feeling outside of the constraints of work. Really listen actively, ask questions that help to clarify. Consider how you'll handle difficult situations in meetings. We stopped here to look at an activity around why the following behaviours might come up in meetings. So being defensive or attacking and blocking out. And we talked a lot about perhaps fear of failure, about not trusting one another, about not understanding the scope of the work and therefore being defensive. We talked about the possibility of having actually made some mistakes and so being very defensive or attacking, and also just the differences among cultures in terms of dealing with failure or dealing with confrontation. So moving on then to further developing and sustaining effective and inclusive partnerships. It's important to understand the extent of the collaboration. So map the partnership in terms of looking at governance structures. So beyond the terms of reference and the MOU, how can your governing bodies, how can your trustees and boards work together to enhance the partnership? Look at resources from each charity. Could you share resources? Can you even share roles and responsibilities across the partnership? For example, if you've got someone doing admin in the UK, could they support your partner organisation with admin? Look at formal protocols and processes outside of the MOU in terms of reference. So, for example, could you share policies and procedures and protocols so as not to duplicate work? Perhaps agree some working groups or steering groups for particularly big pieces of work that might require collaboration across the organisation, but you don't want to involve everyone. Perhaps pick one or two people from each organisation to work on that together, and perhaps agree a communication strategy or plan for internal and external communications and who's going to lead on that. Agree your norms and expectations. Again, this is probably in more detail than the terms of reference. So how are we going to communicate? Will we use email, Slack, WhatsApp, Zoom calls? How often do we want to speak? What timeframes are we working to? And what kind of cultural ways of working are we going to have? So are we going to say there's a strict no checking of emails outside of work hours, or are we going to be more flexible on that? And then look at perhaps agreeing a RACI. So agree who's responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed for each program or project. Working cross-culturally with partnerships, it's really important to be aware of language, obviously. Consider whether you might want to allow partners to do some of their high-level kind of creative thinking in their native language so as not to prohibit that freedom of and flow of thought and thinking. And recognize and question how dominant white culture might show up within your organization. So really hold the mirror up and consider whether you're seeing any of these characteristics coming through in your organization of perfectionism and urgency, worship of the written word, valuing formal education over lived experience, and trying to avoid conflict. One way to overcome this worship of the written word is to perhaps limit the use of sector-specific buzzwords, find other ways to communicate and share information. And one thing that came up in the webinar was that a lot of people were sharing the value of sharing video and photos to keep your UK partners updated rather than a written narrative description, as that comes more freely to some people as a way of communicating. There was quite a lot of good ideas coming through in the chat during this activity, and the chat narrative has also been made available, so you should be able to see that rather than me going into that now. Make sure to involve your partners at strategic planning level. Make sure that you're clear and unambiguous with your objectives and that there's appropriate methods of consultation. Make sure that it's open to anyone who may have a voice to contribute, and make sure that you do an evaluation of how the process worked to make sure that you can learn from anything that perhaps didn't work that well. Look at your culture, both your visible and invisible culture within your organization, and perhaps spend even more time on the invisible than the visible. So looking at your beliefs, shared assumptions, traditions, perceptions, norms, feelings, and any unwritten rules that are present within your organization. We paused here to hear a case study from Power for the People. If you want more information on this, I can ask Nazrin to write a short description. She did an excellent job of explaining here how they had one very effective partnership and one not so much. You can see on here where there are some X's on the left-hand column here. These are things they didn't take into consideration, which meant that the partnership didn't work particularly well. On the right, they took those things into consideration and the partnership was much more effective. So to sustain your partnership, make sure that you're working to ensure that everyone understands expectations, that you're supporting your partners, that you're acknowledging benefits and successes externally as well as internally, and that you have effective risk management. Ensure that you're evaluating what's working. So look back at the original objectives. Do you need to look at your return on investment and time spent on a partnership? Look at the lessons learned. Consider a progress report and the frequency of when you want that progress report to come. And if a narrative progress report like this doesn't work for your partner, then consider other ways of providing that progress report. Be aware of collaboration killers, asking for long feasibility reviews or narrative reports, time-consuming consultation that's taking too long. Reasons for collaboration failure, so underestimating the time to establish the partnership, no leader, no unclear responsibilities, personal agendas, and so on. What will you do if the partnership's not working? You could obtain external support. You could re-energize and look at whether this is just a natural lull in the life cycle of the partnership. You could decide to just fully terminate or discontinue the partnership. But ideally, you'd want to be looking at the root causes and perhaps trying to overcome. And lastly, we touched on risk management and safeguarding. So how will you monitor the end use of funds and ensure that the program implementation is really successful? So again, having your people and reporting structures in place, looking at your finance oversight, where's that going to be happening in the UK or in your partner organization? Looking at who will overall manage the performance of the partnership, looking at your frequency of assessment, perhaps an annual due diligence review would be sufficient, and also just considering the value of whether an in-person assessment from a UK partner is really necessary. And ideally, you want to be working towards a position of trust where you're not having to be physically present in country to be able to do a due diligence assessment of your partner. And finally, safeguarding. Each organisation should have its own safeguarding policy and set of procedures, but you could work towards having a joint safeguarding policy and procedure that both organisations agree to. Safeguarding training should be offered to all staff regularly, and you'll need to decide who will be a safeguarding lead within each organisation. And finally, how will safeguarding issues be handled in reporting and reported, and how are you going to overcome perhaps some of the cultural barriers that may prevent safeguarding issues being reported to the UK organisation. Finally, we paused for questions, and I don't think we had any questions at the end, but as I said, the chat narrative is available to review if you want to look at some of the discussion that we'd had in more detail. Thanks for listening, and if you want to see anything else like this in more detail, you can look at the FSI's website. We've got lots of training coming up over the coming months that will perhaps go into some more detail of things that we've touched on here.